In the late spring of 1940, the collapse of France was not merely a military event but a psychological rupture that spread through ministries, newspapers, cafes, and private apartments with the same speed as German armored columns. For many French civilians, the decision to seek an armistice did not feel like cowardice so much as the exhausted conclusion of a nation that had already bled itself white in one world war and had spent the interwar years quietly doubting whether it could endure another. Letters preserved from Paris, Lyon, and the provincial towns speak less of hatred for Germany than of a crushing sense of historical inevitability, a feeling that the Republic had been overtaken by forces too large and too modern to resist with the institutions and doctrines it possessed. When Marshal Philippe Pétain spoke of ending the fighting, he gave voice to a longing for order and predictability that resonated deeply with families who had fled the roads in 1914 and now found themselves doing so again, 26 years later, under the low drone of aircraft and the glare of burning depots. Yet across the Channel, Britain stood in a different emotional climate, one shaped by geography but also by political culture and memory. British leaders and civilians alike were aware that surrender, once chosen, could not easily be reversed, and that an armistice negotiated from weakness would likely place the country in a position of quiet subordination rather than genuine peace. Winston Churchill's speeches, recorded and transcribed in the days immediately after France's capitulation, reveal a man who understood the odds but also grasped the psychological stakes. To continue fighting was not simply to resist Germany but to preserve the idea that Britain remained an independent actor in history rather than a defeated one waiting for terms. For French listeners who managed to tune in on the BBC, this insistence carried a tone both defiant and unsettling, because it implied that a choice still existed, even when circumstances seemed to have foreclosed all meaningful options. The contrast between these two decisions was experienced by ordinary French people not as an abstract divergence of strategy but as a sudden, disorienting split in the moral landscape of the war. Diaries kept by school teachers in Normandy and shopkeepers in Bordeaux show a complicated mixture of relief that the immediate killing might stop, and shame that their principal ally had chosen to endure alone what France could not. Some wrote of Britain's resolve with admiration tinged by bitterness, as if watching a neighbor refuse to evacuate a burning building that they themselves had just fled. Others interpreted it through the lens of old stereotypes, seeing in Britain's refusal a familiar blend of stubbornness and insularity, made easier by the protection of the sea. In either case, the British decision forced French civilians to reframe their own experience, turning what had felt like an unavoidable collapse into something that could be compared, and therefore judged, against another nation's endurance. This emotional recalibration was intensified by the way news traveled in those chaotic weeks. French newspapers, operating under censorship and pressure from the new Vichy authorities, emphasized the need for stability and the dangers of further resistance, while underground rumors and foreign broadcasts suggested that the war was far from over. The result was a cognitive dissonance in which people heard one story from their own government and another from abroad, and had to decide which narrative better matched their lived reality of defeat and displacement. For a clerk in a provincial town who had watched German soldiers march past his office, Britain's continued fighting could seem either like heroic clarity or like reckless denial, depending on whether he still believed that national will could alter the course of events already written on the streets outside his window. What made this moment so psychologically heavy was that it exposed the fragility of collective identity. France had long defined itself as a great power, a pillar of European order, and its sudden withdrawal from the war left many citizens feeling as though a piece of their own self-understanding had been quietly removed. Britain's choice to continue, by contrast, offered a stark reminder of what France was no longer doing, and therefore of what it might have been. In letters exchanged between separated family members, one finds repeated attempts to reconcile these realities, to explain to children why their country had laid down its arms while another still carried on, and to do so without collapsing into either self-contempt or empty reassurance. In that sense, the strategic divergence between surrender and resistance became, for French civilians, a deeply personal question about endurance, dignity, and the limits of what a society can ask of its people when the weight of history presses down all at once. When word filtered through occupied and unoccupied France that Britain had rejected any thought of negotiation and intended to continue the war alone, it did not arrive as a single clear announcement but as a fragmented series of radio broadcasts, whispered reports, and half-credible rumors that slowly reshaped how people understood their own recent defeat. In Paris, where German patrols were already visible on the boulevards, some families gathered around hidden radios late at night to listen to the BBC, straining to catch Churchill's gravelled English through the static, while others relied on neighbors who claimed to have heard that London had chosen to fight on, even if France could not. The effect was often a stunned stillness rather than immediate emotion, as if civilians needed time to process the idea that the war they had just been told was effectively over for them was, in another sense, only beginning. Diaries from the period capture this uneasy pause with remarkable clarity. In Rouen, a schoolteacher wrote that Britain's decision felt like a door left open behind us, a phrase that conveyed both a faint hope and a quiet reproach, as though someone else had chosen to keep standing when France had already sat down in exhaustion. In Marseille, a dockworker recorded a more ambivalent response, noting that he admired the British resolve but doubted whether it would spare anyone in France from the consequences of defeat, since German soldiers were already in control of the ports and railways that defined his daily life. For many, the news was filtered through the practical reality of occupation or displacement, making it difficult to treat Britain's choice as anything more than a distant moral gesture when their own world had been reduced to ration cards, curfews, and the steady presence of foreign uniforms. Yet even in this constrained environment, the knowledge that Britain had refused to yield altered the emotional texture of everyday conversation. In cafes that were cautiously reopening, people spoke of the British with a mixture of admiration and irritation, sometimes in the same sentence, praising their courage while resenting the implication that France had somehow lacked it. A woman in Tours wrote to her sister that she felt both grateful that someone was still resisting Germany and ashamed that it was not her own country, a duality that produced a low, persistent ache rather than any dramatic outburst. This was not the language of heroic narratives, but of ordinary people trying to reconcile pride, fear, and disappointment in a situation that offered no clean moral categories. The reaction also varied sharply by region and political temperament. In parts of the South, where Vichy's authority was initially stronger and German troops less visible, Britain's continued resistance was sometimes portrayed by local officials as reckless, even dangerous, a provocation that might bring further suffering to Europe. In private, however, many listeners to foreign radio stations quietly took heart from the idea that the conflict had not been fully resolved, that the story of 1940 might not end with the armistice alone. Farmers in the Dordogne and shopkeepers in Clermont-Ferrand wrote of feeling a strange, subdued relief that someone was still holding the line, even if that line was now far away across the channel and beyond their own immediate reach. What made these reactions so psychologically charged was that Britain's decision implicitly reframed what had just happened to France. Defeat no longer appeared as the final chapter of a shared Allied effort, but as a divergent path, one that forced French civilians to look at their own government's choice in the unflattering light of comparison. This did not always lead to overt anger, because many were simply too tired and too preoccupied with survival, but it did introduce a quiet, corrosive doubt that ran beneath public expressions of acceptance. People asked themselves, often only in the privacy of a notebook or a letter, whether France had truly had no alternative, or whether history might one day judge this moment more harshly than they could afford to do in 1940. In this way, Britain's refusal to surrender became less a rallying cry than a persistent psychological presence, a reminder that the war's meaning was still being written elsewhere even as French life narrowed under occupation and compromise. For civilians already struggling to adapt to a new and humiliating normality, that knowledge did not offer easy consolation, but it did prevent the armistice from feeling like a full stop, leaving instead a lingering sense of incompletion that would haunt private thoughts long after the public ceremonies of surrender had faded. By the early months of occupation, the emotional climate inside France had settled into something heavy and airless, a mixture of resignation, suppressed anger, and the daily fatigue of living under rules imposed by a foreign power, while across the channel a very different mood was taking shape, forged by isolation, danger, and a deliberate effort to convert fear into endurance. In French towns where German flags now hung from municipal buildings, morale was not so much broken as compressed, pushed inward by censorship, shortages, and the constant requirement to appear compliant in public, even when private thoughts were filled with bitterness or disbelief. People learned quickly which phrases were safe to say aloud and which had to remain unspoken, and this self-censorship gradually altered how they experienced their own emotions, turning outrage into something quiet and internal rather than openly shared. Letters written from Lyon, Reims, and small provincial communities describe a pervasive sense of being watched, not always by German soldiers themselves, but by the knowledge that any careless word might bring consequences for oneself or one's family. This produced a form of morale that was defensive rather than hopeful, focused on getting through each day with as little disruption as possible, on preserving small routines such as meals, school lessons, and church services as a way of asserting some fragile continuity with the past. Patriotism, when it appeared, was often private and melancholic, expressed in the careful preservation of old newspapers or in the quiet singing of band songs behind closed doors, gestures that were emotionally meaningful precisely because they had no public outlet. In Britain, by contrast, morale was being actively shaped and displayed, not because fear was absent, but because it was being framed as a shared burden that could be transformed into a source of collective identity. The threat of invasion and the reality of air raids created an atmosphere of constant tension, yet British civilians were encouraged, through speeches, broadcasts, and newspapers, to interpret that tension as evidence of their own significance in the wider struggle. Diaries kept in London and coastal towns speak of exhaustion and anxiety, but they also reveal a stubborn pride in endurance, a belief that to keep going even when conditions were grim was itself a form of victory. This did not make the danger any less real, but it did give it a narrative that made suffering feel purposeful rather than merely imposed. The contrast between these two moral climates was stark, even though both societies were living under extreme pressure. In France, the absence of open resistance and the presence of an officially sanctioned collaborationist government blurred the line between survival and acquiescence, leaving many people unsure how to interpret their own behavior. In Britain, the very lack of such a compromise created a clearer, if more perilous, emotional structure in which endurance could be openly praised and shared. French civilians, listening secretly to British radio or reading smuggled reports, could not help but notice this difference, and for some it produced a painful sense of having been left behind in a story that was still unfolding elsewhere. This divergence was not simply a matter of propaganda or leadership, but reflected the deeper psychological effects of defeat versus defiance. Occupied France was a society forced to adapt to limits imposed from outside, which encouraged caution, inwardness, and a kind of moral quietude, while Britain was a society that, for the moment, had chosen to define itself through resistance, even at enormous cost. Neither posture was emotionally simple, and neither was free from fear, but they generated very different ways of understanding what it meant to live through the war. For a French shopkeeper closing his shutters at dusk under curfew, the war felt like a narrowing of life into smaller and smaller spaces. Whereas for a British clerk making his way through a bomb-damaged street, it felt like a dangerous expansion into a future that was still uncertain but not yet closed. In this contrast, morale became less about optimism or despair and more about the direction in which people felt their lives were being pushed, either inward toward survival and accommodation or outward toward risk and continued engagement. For French civilians, aware of Britain's defiance yet trapped in their own constrained reality, this difference created a quiet, often unspoken tension that would linger beneath the surface of everyday life, shaping how they understood both their own choices and those of a nation that had refused, for better or worse, to stop fighting. Across France in the months that followed the armistice, conversations about what had happened and what should have been done did not settle into a single, stable consensus, but instead fractured into a wide spectrum of private judgments about honor, survival, and the meaning of resistance in a defeated country. In personal letters and notebooks, people tried to articulate positions that were rarely spoken aloud, weighing the instinct to endure quietly against the lingering belief that dignity required some form of refusal, even if it could not be openly enacted. A retired railway clerk in Amiens wrote to his son that he felt no shame in wanting simply to stay alive and keep the family together, yet in the same paragraph he confessed a deep unease at the thought that their silence might be mistaken, someday, for agreement. This tension between the need to survive and the desire to remain morally intact ran through countless such documents, giving them a tone that was less about certainty than about quiet, unresolved struggle. For some civilians, honor was inseparable from continued opposition, however limited and symbolic it might be. Teachers in provincial schools described small acts of defiance, such as refusing to repeat official slogans or quietly correcting textbooks that had been altered to suit the new regime, as a way of preserving what they felt France still stood for, even if no one could openly say it. These gestures were not usually dramatic, and their authors did not imagine themselves as heroes, but they provided a private reassurance that something essential had not been entirely surrendered. In this view, resistance was less a military act than a psychological one, a refusal to let defeat define the whole of one's inner life. Others, however, framed survival itself as a form of integrity, arguing that to endure the occupation without being crushed was not cowardice but a necessary patience in the face of overwhelming force. A shopkeeper in Angers wrote that feeding his children and keeping his business alive felt more urgent and more real than any abstract call to resist, because those everyday acts were what allowed the family to remain intact in a world that had suddenly become precarious. To him, honor lay in protecting what could still be protected, even if that meant outwardly conforming to rules he despised. This position did not arise from indifference but from a sober assessment of power and vulnerability, and it was often accompanied by a quiet hope that time, rather than immediate action, would eventually alter the balance. Between these poles lay a wide middle ground of conflicted opinion, where people admired those who resisted yet doubted whether such acts could truly change their circumstances. Diaries from Brittany and the Loire Valley show individuals wrestling with admiration for courage on the one hand and fear for their own families on the other, unsure how to reconcile these impulses without betraying either. Some wrote of feeling morally inferior to those who took risks, while others questioned whether those risks were justified when reprisals could fall on entire communities. In these reflections, resistance was not an abstract virtue but a complicated choice with tangible consequences, and honor was something that had to be negotiated within the limits imposed by occupation. What made these debates so intense was that they unfolded in a society where public discussion was constrained and official narratives offered little space for nuance. The Vichy regime's emphasis on order, work, and quiet submission clashed with older Republican ideals of citizenship and duty, leaving civilians to sort out their own ethical positions in relative isolation. In letters passed discreetly between friends, one finds long, careful arguments about what it meant to be French under these new conditions, arguments that reveal not only disagreement but a shared anxiety about being judged by history in ways they could not yet foresee. For many, the fear was not just of German power but of how their own choices would be remembered once the war's outcome was known. In this atmosphere, honor, survival, and resistance were not fixed categories but shifting, deeply personal interpretations of what it meant to live through defeat, and the diversity of these views underscores how profoundly the occupation unsettled any simple notion of right and wrong. Beneath the surface of what French civilians said about Britain's continued fighting, about their own defeat, and about the choices now forced upon them, there lay a deeper landscape of fear, hope, and political fracture that had been forming for years and was suddenly brought into the open by the shock of 1940. The fall of the Republic did not erase the ideological tensions that had divided France throughout the interwar period, but it stripped away the institutions that had kept those tensions contained, leaving people to interpret events through the lenses they already carried with them. For conservatives who had long distrusted parliamentary democracy, the collapse seemed to confirm their belief that France needed authority and order more than argument, and Britain's defiance could appear not heroic but dangerously naive, a refusal to accept what they saw as geopolitical reality. For others, particularly those who still believed in the values of the Republic, the British decision to keep fighting was experienced as a painful reminder of what France had lost, not only in military terms but in its confidence in its own political ideals. Fear was the most immediate and universal of these underlying forces, shaping reactions in ways that were often contradictory and difficult to admit. People feared German power with its capacity for reprisal and control, but they also feared chaos, the breakdown of everyday life into something unrecognizable and unmanageable. When civilians spoke of wanting peace or of accepting the armistice, it was often less an endorsement of the occupier than a desperate wish to stabilize a world that had suddenly become frighteningly uncertain. In that context, Britain's choice to continue the war could provoke anxiety as much as admiration, because it implied that the conflict, and therefore the danger, was not going to end quickly or neatly. At the same time, there was a quieter current of hope that ran through many of these reactions, even when it was expressed in guarded or indirect ways. The knowledge that Britain was still resisting allowed some French civilians to imagine that their own situation might not be permanent, that occupation was a phase rather than a final state. In letters written with careful euphemism, people spoke of waiting and holding on, phrases that suggested an expectation, however faint, that history had not yet delivered its last verdict. This hope was fragile and often accompanied by skepticism, but it gave emotional meaning to small acts of endurance, turning mere survival into something that could be interpreted as a form of quiet anticipation. Political divisions also shaped how civilians interpreted both their own defeat and Britain's defiance. Supporters of the new Vichy regime tended to emphasize the need for reconciliation and national regeneration, portraying resistance as a dangerous relic of a discredited past, while critics, even when forced into silence, saw in Britain's stance a validation of their belief that the war had not been morally or politically settled. These differences did not usually erupt into open confrontation because the risks were too high, but they influenced the tone of private conversations and the way people framed their own choices. In families and small communities, one could find deep, unspoken disagreements about what loyalty now meant, disagreements that mirrored the broader fractures in French society. What made this moment so psychologically complex was that fear, hope, and political belief were not neatly separated but intertwined in the minds of individuals who were trying to make sense of events that had overturned their assumptions about stability and progress. A person could long for peace and yet secretly wish for Britain to succeed, could accept the armistice in practice while rejecting it in spirit, could fear German authority and still doubt whether open resistance was wise or just. These overlapping impulses gave civilian reactions a tone of ambiguity that does not fit easily into later narratives of collaboration or resistance. But it is precisely in that ambiguity that the deeper emotional and political reality of the time can be most clearly seen. Long after the first shock of defeat and the initial shock of Britain's defiance had passed, the way French civilians reacted in those early months continued to shape how the war was remembered, not only in public commemorations but in the quiet, private narratives people carried with them for the rest of their lives. Memory does not preserve events in a neutral way, and the emotions that accompanied those first reactions became part of the framework through which later experiences were interpreted, giving them a coherence that was often more psychological than strictly factual. For many who had lived through 1940, the moment when they learned that Britain would continue fighting became a kind of moral reference point, a hinge in memory against which later choices and compromises were measured, sometimes gently, sometimes with a persistent, unresolved discomfort. In post-war diaries and interviews, one finds older men and women returning to that moment with a mixture of clarity and uncertainty, recalling not so much what they had said or done but how it had felt to realize that the war was not finished simply because France had stepped back from it. Those who had experienced a flicker of hope at Britain's decision often described that feeling as something that sustained them through the dull, grinding years of occupation, even when they took no overt action themselves. The memory of that hope did not necessarily translate into pride, but it did provide a narrative in which endurance could be seen as more than mere passivity, as a way of staying emotionally aligned with a future that had once seemed possible. For others, the same moment carried a more troubling legacy, because it highlighted the gap between what they had privately admired and what they had publicly accepted. People who had inwardly respected Britain's refusal to surrender but outwardly adapted to Vichy's demands sometimes remembered this contradiction with a quiet sense of shame or unease, not because they believed they should have acted differently, but because they recognized how deeply circumstances had constrained their moral agency. In later years, when France sought to define itself through stories of resistance and liberation, these memories could feel out of place, reminders of a more ambiguous reality that did not fit neatly into heroic frameworks. The psychological weight of those early reactions also influenced how families told their own war stories. Children and grandchildren often heard about 1940 through anecdotes that emphasized either stoic endurance or quiet admiration for those who kept fighting, and in both cases the British decision to continue became a symbolic element in a larger narrative about what the war had meant to their parents or grandparents. These stories were not always precise, but they conveyed an emotional truth about how it felt to live through a time when national identity, personal safety, and moral conviction were all in flux at once. In this way, the reactions of civilians were transmitted across generations, shaping not only historical understanding but the deeper sense of what it meant to have been French in a moment of collective vulnerability. Even in public memory, where simplification is often unavoidable, traces of this complexity remained. Official commemorations might focus on resistance and liberation, but beneath those themes lay an undercurrent of reflection about the choices that had been made when the outcome was still uncertain. For many, the knowledge that Britain had refused to give in, even when France had done so, introduced a note of humility into how the war was later remembered, a recognition that national narratives are always entangled with the actions of others and with the limits imposed by circumstance. In the end, The lasting psychological meaning of those early civilian reactions was not a single lesson but a lingering sensitivity to the fragility of moral certainty in times of crisis. A quiet awareness that what people feel, fear, and hope in the first moments of upheaval can echo for decades, shaping how they remember not only the war but themselves within it.